I want to say, if you like. So you asked me to talk about the year 1970, and that is atypical. It's atypical in my life. It was rather grim and depressing because I had been earning a bachelor's degree at NYU in economics, and I finished up actually in 1969, and then I had to decide what to do with myself. And by that point, I mean, I was basically a non-entity in the New York cultural community at that point. Or I mean, I had perhaps one of the lowest profiles that I've had in the entire time that I've been in New York. And I actually considered moving to Nashville and getting a job in a bank. And if I had done that, then country music would have been my only avocation. I mean, I would not have continued any of the other things. But at any rate, for whatever reason, I did not do that. And so I moved to a rooming house in the Bronx on East Tremont. I was just in one room there. And then I set out to find a job basically in the financial industry with the economics degree. And I remember I had an archive of various magazines and newspapers and so forth where I'd either had things published or whether there'd been things published about me and so forth. And I took it up there and decided that just living in a single room, that I couldn't really keep the whole archive. I didn't have the space for it, so I had to reduce it somehow. So I was just tearing out individual pages out of magazines and so forth, or just clippings basically, and turning it into a scrapbook. And I remember how strongly I felt at that time that nobody was ever going to be interested in any of this. I mean, that this is just, nobody is going to care that I did this thing in 1963 or that thing in 1966 or anything like that. The concept art, you may or may not know this, but John Lennon had gotten a big article in Look magazine in March of 1969 in order to announce that Yoko Ono was the inventor of concept art. And along with that, of course, conceptual art was just beginning to peak for the first time. And I actually had no social connection with that group whatsoever. Except, actually, I mean, I knew individuals, you know, like Robert Morris and Yoko Ono. I knew them, but I mean, to be quite blunt about it, since there's no reason not to be blunt, I mean, they were sort of very sorry that I existed, and I mean, they would have been quite happy if I had simply disappeared or something like that. I mean, I was simply an irritant from the point of view of their claim of priority or something like that. I mean, the only thing that people actually gained or took from me was the label concept art. They had no idea on what I meant by it or what I was doing. So that was not even an issue. And so there I was in the rooming house in the Bronx and looking for a job in the Wall Street area, and assuming that basically any kind of significance or attention, what I've been doing for the last 8 years or 9 years or however you count it, that was basically finished. There was one event at the very beginning of the year. I was invited to go to one of the very first concerts that Pandit Pranat, the North Indian vocalist, gave in New York. He was brought to New York by Shyam Bhatnagar, who was a figure on the scene in several connections and also closely associated with Lamont Young. At that time, of course, Lamont and Marion were in the Church Street loft where they are now, and where they were for most of the entire period. But Harrison Street had not happened for them. That would only happen, a decade later. And Sham, I guess one of his sponsors or proteges or whatever was a woman named Barbara Stacy, I believe, who lived on West 14th Street. And so this concert that I attended in January of 1970 took place there on West 14th Street. I may have been invited directly by Lamont, but I don't even remember that. I remember very vividly that Shane Mage and Larry Poons were in the audience. I don't remember sort of the exact course of my acquaintance with Larry Poons, but we hung out a considerable amount in the early 70s. And so he was there. And I mean, there's a great irony in all of that, because I mean, one of Pranat's lyrics was "Return to your true self," and I mean, this was the the season of my life when I began sort of drifting, farther and farther away from who I was, and I was really beginning to lose, I guess, what I would have to call my creative faculties, because I did end up getting a job in an economic consulting firm. Basically, I was just a clerk copying numbers. And I mean, like I began to eat too much, to become overweight and so forth. I mean, obviously compensating for the boredom. And I remember, I mean, there was I had a 2-hour commute on the D train every day down from Tremont, from East Tremont to Wall Street. And I remember I was still trying to hold on to what I knew how to do, and I composed one piece for violin that spring, and I remember, trying to work on the score as I was riding the subway to work in the morning. And I mean, I was just trying to hang on to my ability to compose, but I mean, it didn't work. I mean, I got a chance to perform that piece in May of '70 at Anthology Film Archives. I gave a concert there. But, I mean, in some ways, I mean, it was sort of the most strained piece of music, maybe that I ever composed. I mean, I was just trying to prove to myself that I could still compose. But it really was not working. And let me see. I had a number of well, I still was able to continue some of my interests, but basically, I mean, I would work the 5 days, and then I would sort of sleep all day Saturday to recover, and Sunday would be the only day of the week that I was sort of normal, and I had to have, it was only when the holidays came along, I mean, sort of the 3-day weekends, that I was able to actually do anything of any significance, usually on Monday. And I just remember it as a period in which it was such a struggle to sort of hold on to any part of myself at all. I didn't really meet anybody at the job except one person that I may mention, Alina Novak, because she comes back later. In the second half of 1970, I got an opportunity to begin graduate school at the New School in economics, and so I left the job and started there in September. And I guess about a year later, Alina started attending the New School, so that I ran into her in graduate school. She became known for starting what was called networking, which was a feminist, the idea of it was simply getting women into higher positions in corporate management. That was actually the goal of it. And I mean, she became, I guess, something of a public figure around that at some point in the 70s. But at any rate, I mean, that was about the only person that I met at the job who even sort of came back, you know, after I quit. I mean, for the rest of it, I would just have to call it a total waste or a total loss. At the Pronaut concert back in January, that was before I'd gotten the job. But you know, it is so strange to me to think of going because of what he was as a musician. I mean, and as I say, I mean, it will just give you some idea that, I mean, the lyric of one of his performances, "Return to Your True Self." You know, hearing him live for the first time, I may have heard him on recording at Lamont's Loft, but hearing him live for the first time, I picked up especially on his use of descending glissandi, especially in the lowest octave. I mean, that's called meend in the Hindustani terminology. And I mean, it was just this, you know, like this music almost from another planet, you know, from the one that I was trying to live on. And by the way, I mean, one thing that I can't understand, I do not remember the subway ride back up to the Bronx. You know, there must have been that subway ride, you know, like at 11 in the evening or something like that. And, you know, I can't understand why I don't remember it, actually, because, I mean, it certainly would have been inconvenient, you know, or a little strenuous. But I remember that I can tell you an anecdote about Shane Mage, who was there. I walk in and, you know, here's a man, you know, sitting on the floor, sort of just blissed out, you know, in the lotus position. And Barbara Stacy and another woman are sort of standing over him, and they began to talk about him. And I guess it was Barbara Stacy who said, "Oh, well, that's Shane Maga." And you know, he had been absolutely blissed out and oblivious, but he looked up and he said, "Well, actually, you know, I guess it should be pronounced Maga, but I pronounce it Mage." And I said, "Shane Mage? Why, you were the leader of the Proletarian Attack Brigade of the Socialist Workers' Party." And one of the two women said, what's the Socialist Workers' Party? And Shane made a face and said that was a previous incarnation. It's a vivid memory, since I guess that he truly went through a total metamorphosis. He was something of a public figure in the far left in the mid-'60s. I may mention that in the mid-'60s I was also in the sectarian left. Of course, that's why I would have known about him. But at any rate, I still had certain intellectual interests that had sort of carried over from the late '60s when I was at NYU, and I remember, I probably wrote the first draft of the Logic of Admissible Contradictions at that point. I mean, under these very difficult circumstances of being in the rooming house and basically only being able to snatch one day, you know, here or there to work. But it is a piece that turns up in Blueprint, or part of it turns up in Blueprint for a Higher Civilization. And I'd been reading, the last course that I took at NYU was at the University Heights campus, which they no longer have. So that I'd already been sort of commuting to the Bronx even before I moved up there. And I'd begun reading theoretical physics and mathematical physics, and I'd also been doing a lot of reading in neurocybernetics, which at that time, I mean, sort of the grand old man of the field was Norbert Wiener at that time. It's sort of the earliest attempt to understand how to explain consciousness, or attempts to explain consciousness in a scientific or a medical model. I guess that today that would be called brain science. As a matter of fact, right now, this field is a tremendous fad in academic philosophy right now. But I've begun reading about that, and I wrote an essay on simply various scientific speculations about consciousness. I mean, sort of putting them one after the other. That was just like a report for myself of what was actually going on. But another thing, I went back to my analyst at that point. My analyst, Mel Shulman, he is actually the husband of Claire Shulman, actually, the borough president of Queens. When I first saw him, it was in the mid-'60s, and his office was on Fifth Avenue, and then he moved farther east uptown. And I guess that I went back to him because I was sort of very, very concerned about what direction I was going in at that point, and sort of what I ought to do, or how I was going to make a living, how I was going to square that with what I really ought to be doing, and so forth. But I guess that because his office was on the Upper East Side, that there was a branch of the public library up there, and I found one of these physics popularizations in the library of the kind that there are so many of them now that one cannot even keep up with them. I mean, the sort of thing that Hawking writes and innumerable other people. But I read that, and especially what they had to say about virtual particles and so forth and so on. I began to feel, there is some kind of, there is something about this which is really a hoax, or in other words, there's really getting away with something here. Perhaps, what I was sort of reaching for, it was said to me in a letter by Dick Hoxema, who is a Dutch philosopher of science. He said that the electron is as much of an artwork as anything that has ever been shown in a gallery. And I guess that sort of is the thought that I was reaching for, just reading this popularization. Then I began reading more serious books at the University Heights campus, trying to substantiate it. I did my first piece on physics, the first piece which was a commentary on physics as it is practiced in the universities. And a lot of these things were sort of these extremely rudimentary beginnings, just very short pieces. But for example, the physics one, I now have a long essay on my website, which I think is called The Disintegration of Possibility, which continues, exactly this series of essays. So, the Disintegration of Possibility was written in 1993. So it was, I guess, 23 years after the first, the opening essay. So, in many of these things, I started out with a very primitive, very rudimentary attempt, and then I pursued sort of the same line over a period of many years, and of course I would like to think now that it's much stronger. All of it. The admissible contradictions. Just this spring, I wrote what is meant to be my magnum opus on the logic of contradictions. So that's another one that I've been working on continuously. Let me see. The second edition of An Anthology, the book edited by Lamont Young, where my concept art piece appeared, where it was first published in book form. The second edition came out in 1970. And because I knew George Maciunas very well, I essentially revised my own section in the book extensively and had him slip it in, since he was handling all of the physical production of the book. Lamont was very annoyed by that because none of the others revised their pieces. I guess my piece was the only one that was revised. But one of the reasons why I did that, I wanted to have as many of the titles of my unpublished manuscripts. I wanted to get those titles into print because I believed that I would never have an opportunity to publish. And I mean, I was really really felt far more out of it, I guess, than I am now. I mean, I felt completely invisible, no access whatsoever, and it was very hard for me to sort of, you know, play the system and sort of reap the rewards that it offered. I mean, that was still, as a matter of fact, I mean, just graduating from college, it seemed like there was a delay and then another delay. I mean, I had to take this summer course in the Bronx, whereas, I mean, I'd been scheduled to finish at Washington Square College in the spring. So, I mean, I was basically taking makeup work or something like that in the summer, and then I waited and waited for my final transcript to come and so forth. It didn't come until October. And, I mean, I had serious doubts about whether I could do something as basic as, you know, earning a college degree. I mean, it was not, I did not believe that I lacked intrinsic ability, but I had a terrible difficulty sort of cashing in with the system. It was terribly difficult. And, I mean, it happens to have been very significant for me and also probably for Tony Conrad that there was a friend, somebody that we knew named Dennis Johnson, who is also in an anthology, and who was one of these, like the post-cage, sort of California post-cage avant-garde. By the time that he gets into an anthology, he is no longer involved in what you could call music. I mean, it's all posture. I mean, he was just supplying postures. I mean, actually, his main contribution in the anthology was just a letter that he wrote to Lamont Young about contemplating suicide and sort of, you know, ha, 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 and I don't care about anything and so forth and so on. As a matter of fact, I guess that he should be sort of given credit for inventing a posture which subsequently was extensively exploited by the Church of the Subgenius and the Neoists and, you know, all of these other I guess, you know, the print equivalent of punk rock, you know, or something like that. I mean, he may have been one of the first people to posture like that. I mean, another thing that he did in '63 is that he stood in Washington Square Park, and he had a scrap of paper that he pulled out of a garbage can, and he tried to sell it to people, you know, passing by for $100. And he managed to stop an advertising executive or something, and I mean, the man did not buy it from him, but, you know, complimented him on his sales pitch and all of that kind of thing. But, I mean, he subsequently, he became a derelict, or as we would say at the time, a bum. And I remember, you know, very well that he was sort of staying alive by, he would go into a diner or something and just eat the ketchup, you know, from the dispenser on the table and that sort of thing. Then he began driving a taxi cab. And I guess he was a cab driver around 67 or something like that. And then he decided, you know, sort of, why am I, you know, beating up on myself by doing this? And so somehow, I don't understand exactly how he enrolled in UCLA in the mathematics program, and it seems that somehow he finished the undergraduate and the PhD program in about 3 years or something like that. I don't remember the exact, but he just tore through the program, earned his PhD, and went immediately to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And at that time, I mean, I think that may have been significant to me and to Tony, because we sort of, as I say, we both had problems playing the system or sort of cashing in with the system. And I think that the example that he set of that may have helped us a lot, convincing us that it was possible to do that. I had applied for a Lehman Fellowship for a graduate study. I don't know exactly. I guess that I had to have applied while I was still at NYU, so that would have been in '69. But then for some reason they were all canceled, and so that I did not begin at the new school with the fellowship. But it was reinstated, so that the next year I think that I did have the fellowship. I mean, at that time, it was big. I mean, it was 5,000 a year, which, I mean, it sounds ridiculous today, but that, I mean, my salary at the Wall Street clerical job was 7,000. So, I mean, it was only a couple of thousand below, you know, like a legitimate job, I guess. So it seemed like a lot of money at the time. But I mean, that was a very strange experience for me to be able to exact anything at all from the system, because I was simply used to being sort of completely shut out. I mean, that was normal. Dennis shows up at the Institute for Advanced Study. That gave me the opportunity to visit him. That's another thing that I was able to do in this ghastly spring of 1970. I visited him twice down there, and I mean, it was possible to have a lot of conversations about mathematics and logic and so forth and so on. I feel today that I sort of made him out to be more than he actually is, or I mean, I wanted to admire him. I mean, from my point of view today, I mean, he was just sort of a sort of an unredeemable square intellectually. I mean, just completely square. But I mean, at the time, I wanted to. He claimed to be working on in mathematical physics, working along the lines of I guess the sort of thing that Penrose was doing about gravitational collapse, or I mean the idea of passing from one universe to another, sort of through a kind of a neck in hyperspace or whatever it was. But I remember at one of the two times that I went down there, I mean, he became exasperated with me and with what I was trying to do with this so-called logic of contradictions and so forth. I mean, a lot of the encounters that I had were not fun encounters at all. I mean, they were actually, I found myself in confrontations with people who sort of were able to speak for the going thing, or for sort of what was really happening, as they would say. And I mean, the chasm between us, or the irreconcilable hostility. You know, Dennis finally told me, he said, you have simply, you want to be a mathematician, you have simply risen to your level of incompetence. I mean, you shouldn't be trying to do this. You don't have any talent for this field. And, I mean, he thought that I wasn't saying anything. I mean, I will never forget that when I told him about the waterfall illusion, which is the illusion, I mean, one way of seeing it is that you just have to turn around and around with your eyes open, basically so that you have a lot of sort of motion across your eyes. And then you stop and you just look at anything, and it appears to be swimming or to be moving in place. And I told him about that, and I said, you can have experiences of the logically impossible. I mean, because you can have an experience of stationary motion. I will never forget that he said, "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that." I mean, so it was like this was about. I mean, if there was evidence that their theory was not complete, then you simply swept the evidence under the rug. By the way, I think that there was a World's Fair that year in Japan. And he had been invited to have one of the exhibits. And what he actually did was he did a topological room. It was a room where all of the 6 faces of the room were mirrors. And then in the corner of the room, he just had a little curved, just sort of a curved, it would be like a section out of a sphere that was just sort of in the corner. And let me see, I don't remember. Oh, yes, that's right. By the way, it may not have been, the room may not have been a cube. It may have been a pyramid, you know, a triangular shaped room. But with the idea of it was that it was one of the solids which packs space, which means that if you repeat it over and over, that it fills space to infinity. So the whole idea of it was that in the first place, you would see yourself and this room replicated in every direction to infinity. That was the first idea. And then where he had this little sort of curved surface in the corner, that became like an enormous inner tube when it was reflected, which you actually saw it go all the way around the universe, to sort of go all the way around and to come back from sort of the other end of infinity. That was the idea of it. And he had designed this by playing with some little mirrors or something that he bought at the dime store and that he had on the table in his room at the Institute for Advanced Study. He was complaining about the fact that they were not using glass mirrors, but rather just metal mirrors. And then I saw an article about it in the New York Times in which they said that everybody was doing mirror rooms at the World's Fair. I mean, everybody apparently had the same idea at the same time. And they were talking about sort of how, you know, like that everybody was coming away blinded, you know, from all the reflections or something from the World's Fair. But I was kind of, you know, I must say, I guess that I was a little bit envious about that because he had been given sort of the platform, you know, this platform of sponsorship, the backing and everything like that, which of course I could not have gained that for my concept art in any way whatsoever. But I remember that, I mean, those were very important to me, both in terms of the intellectual confrontations that took place and the role that he continued to play. I mean, also my colleague Krister Henniks, he played the same role for Krister as a sort of advisor about what goes on in the mathematical establishment or what the establishment's position is on this or that. And also just the example that he was able to almost magically cash in on the system at that point. Let me see. There were a number of things that had happened in 1969. I mean, 69 was sort of more of a normal year for me. I'd given a private concert, mainly of violin music, at Young's Loft in October of 69. I remember that Sean Bhatnagar came to that with his American girlfriend or wife or whatever, and I remember them walking out on that. I think that Krister was there. That was the first time Krister ever saw me. And Larry Coons was there. These are just some of the things that I remember about that event. Oh yes, in March of that year, that was when there had been the Look magazine article, Yoko Ono invented concept art. That summer, the Art Workers Coalition, I think that's what it was called, they had a meeting because they were going to design a poster protesting the Vietnam War, probably the My Lai massacre. And I remember going to that meeting. It was very argumentative, very contentious. They got very angry at each other over how it was going to be handled and everything. But it was also announced that I think that a group of women were going to start something, I think it was called Women Artists in Revolution. Summer of 1969, they were going to have their first meeting in Joan Snyder's loft on Mulberry Street. And they had a little flyer that said something like, I don't know, men go to the moon or something, or why are not women sent to the moon, or something like that. And they just happened to mention, you know, like in the elevator, I mean, actually leaving the Art Workers Coalition meeting, that men could also attend this meeting. And so I attended it. And as I remember it, I mean, I put out my pamphlet, Down with Art, my principal anti-art pamphlet in 1968. And I remember carrying that pamphlet to the meeting and showing it to them, but I mean, I think they were a little miffed or something that I had brought, you know, any kind of a brochure, any kind of propaganda to their meeting. But at any rate, I mean, when they actually started, as I remember it, I mean, I tried to say absolutely nothing and just be sort of a purely a listener. I mean, basically not responding to what they were saying at all, but just taking it in. And that was, I mean, that was another important thing. I mean, it was important the way that the Dennis Johnson meetings were important, and also the way that knowing Alina Novak, I mean, when I knew her a year or two later, and she was starting the networking movement of, I guess, that I was sort of getting very sort of up close, very direct exposure to certain sort of social tendencies or approaches or something like that, which would, as the decades went by, I mean, they would prove to be quite characteristic, actually. I mean, networking turned out to be very characteristic of feminism. And the sort of the Ms. Magazine posture. Gloria Steinem, yes. I mean, sort of the Gloria Steinem approach. And women artists in revolution. Just to try to make a long story short. Now, we're talking about maybe July or August of 1969 in a loft on Mulberry Street. I mean, this is, of course, this is me saying what I think and how I perceived it, but I had the impression that I did not have an impression. Of course, I mean, I was there, and my conclusions were, I mean, I had pick up that I'd been at Harvard, and I'd sort of been, I mean, pressure from certain fellow students to get involved in the avant-garde, and that eventually led to me coming to New York in 1960 to meet Lamont Young, and then doing my first concert in New York at Yoko Ono's loft in February of 1961 in the series that Lamont was curating at that time. It was at that point that I met Cage for the first time. I mean, I'd been studying his music for several years. So I met him and a number of the other figures. Richard Maxfield, of course, but I guess that Cage is the one that I remember the most vividly. But I guess that I had entered this New York scene perhaps as something of a sidekick of Lamont Young's or something like that. So that the core of my when I first encountered the art world, I mean, perhaps as an aspiring, somebody aspiring to, you couldn't really talk about a career or about professionalism at that time. I mean, that really came later. I mean, the career, well, of course there were other artists who were career artists. But, I mean, we did not, in this little clique, we did not necessarily respect I mean, like for example, abstract expressionism did not exist insofar as we were concerned. I mean, I got this very abrupt exposure to the crisis of the new. I mean, that's what I would call it. And then, I mean, in the conversations that took place in early 1961 with Robert Morris at that time, and I mean, you can actually go back and read the letters that he was writing to Lamont Young and so forth and so on. I mean, it was much more sort of why is there a need for the object in the gallery? I mean, what would later be actually what would be height as the dematerialization of art and as conceptualism and minimalism and so forth and so on. It was happening then in inchoate form. And so, I mean, my first exposure, I mean, was not with, say, an abstract expressionist or, I mean, whatever. I mean, I can't even think of somebody else who is appropriate to mention. It would be quote unquote more conservative than abstract expressionism. Let me see, the fellow at Albers, the one who was at Black Mountain, that sort of thing. I mean, it was not even about that. It was not even about doing something which was decorative or pleasing or which expressed oneself or something like that. I mean, it had already sort of gone off the rails, or at least that is what we believed, or I mean, that was the premise on which my participation was invited. I mean, a typical example, for example, I mean, the last event, I think, at AG Gallery, which was George Machunas' gallery on Madison Avenue, where there was a series in 1961 that I was in. I had a couple of evenings there. The last event was Ray Johnson's event, Nothing, which by that time Machunas had not been paying Con Edison. The lights had been cut off. And Ray Johnson just placed these round sticks on the stairway, which was dark, which was going upstairs to a locked gallery, since it had closed and Machunas had absconded to Europe or whatever, I don't remember the exact details. But, I mean, the visitors were supposed to start up the stairs, and trip on the sticks, fall down the stairs, and break their necks. And, that was the piece Nothing by Ray Johnson. And, I mean, that was sort of the mood or, like the orbit in which I was trying to be a player. I mean, I would say that had everything to do with the fact that I arrived at an anti-art position in 1962. I mean, I was analyzing, from the idea of, I mean, you go to this gallery and then to that gallery. Everybody's doing abstract expressionism. It was quite well known that chimpanzees could paint similar pictures. I mean, that had already been in Life magazine, in all the magazines. At least one artist had built a machine to paint abstract expressionist paintings mechanically, and so forth and so on. I mean, with brushes that were attached to mechanical wheels and so forth and so on. And, I began to ask, why do I have to like this? What is the artist's claim on me? And, I mean, perhaps the artist is expressing himself, although actually I would have given quite an argument over that, because I would have said that the genre is totally dominant. I would say that a poem like a sonnet is, 99% about the form sonnet and 1% about what the individual poet might have been able to inject into it. I mean, it was the genre, the form, in any case. But what is the artist's claim on me? And even if the artist were expressing himself, what is that to do with me? I mean, why am I supposed to respect that? And of course, I mean, I did not feel in any way challenged, or I did not feel that the artist or the artwork in any way had the advantage of me or challenged me, except, I mean, in there was a competition, I guess you would say, to be absurd, or to be, but it was, even though the artist had no formal training in logic or mathematics or anything like that, I mean, their attempts to make the absurd gesture were intensely logical. And it was very, very different from the kind of scandal mongering that was associated with Klein using nude women as paintbrushes, or with, Nam June Paik sort of running amok with a meat cleaver, whatever he did in his performances. I mean, it became like a mental game of, I can be sort of more absurd, I can have a higher degree of refusal, I can sort of disappear, and so forth and so on. Here I am at this Women Artists in Revolution in 1969, and I thought that I should at least inform them, that it was possible actually to be against art. I mean, today while I don't want to back off in any way, but I think that the fact that I was in a landscape of European modernism, it did have a great deal to do with the way that I framed my arguments. And for example, if I'd grown up in India in the 19th century, the early 20th century, I don't think that I could have come to the same arguments if I'd been surrounded by Hindustani music or something like that. I mean, I don't think that the same arguments would have occurred to me, probably because I would not have had the same degree of the sense of the arbitrariness of the artwork, because that was the basis on which the artwork was being presented to the public. That was the selling point, was the arbitrariness. I mean, as I later learned, Rauschenberg and Johns began their career, doing monochromes. I mean, I didn't know that then. And also, I mean, I knew that monochromes had appeared in Russia, at the beginning of the 20th century. I did not realize sort of how pretentiously the monochrome had been elaborated in Russia. I mean, there were competing schools of monochromes in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, with the white painting fighting the black painting, and so forth and so on. But the sense of the arbitrariness of the object, the fact they were actually, in fact, boasting about that, that shaped the particular argument that I made when I sort of officially quit art in 1962. And this is way off of your topic, but if you don't know this, I should probably mention that I gave some anti-art lectures. Two of them were sponsored by Lamont Young, and two of them were at Harvard and were sponsored by Christian Wolff. And a lot of people came to them. I mean, Robert Morris, Walter De Maria, Jackson McLough, Christian Wolff, Cage brought Virgil Thompson to the one that I gave on Avenue D in the summer of '62. I had presented this idea. I mean, I was trying to tell them, this is what you have to do if you really mean it. This is the next step. And, they just brushed it off. Basically, they were not really hearing me. I mean, in some cases, they wrote long letters to me. So I have letters, and you can actually see sort of what they got and what they didn't get. And in some cases, they argued for art on the basis that it was a pastime like chess, that it was simply something that they did to evade boredom. And you see that. But at any rate, now I'm at the meeting of Women Artists in Revolution. And, their perception of what art is seemed to have been around like sort of the mystique of the male abstract expressionist. And it seemed to be important to them because this was a social role that carried a great deal of prestige and in some cases was well rewarded financially also. And it was like being an astronaut. They seemed to see, in other words, this is something that is happening. Women ought, in other words, in effect, they were saying, this is a field which is overstaffed by men. Some of these sinecures or whatever you want to call them ought to be going to women. So I mean, they were sort of framing a concept of women sort of invading the palace in a kind of flying wedge, you know, like the idea of a group of women artists sort of invading the palace in a flying wedge, or something like that. Interestingly enough, they did not talk about the women artists like at mid-20th century who you might say were legitimate contenders, or do you know, what was her name? Nikki San Fillet.
The one who has the perfume, yeah. The snakes, the psychedelic kind of snaky.
Perhaps so. In around 1960, I think she was a member of the New Realists group, I think, and she was painting by sort of shooting paint capsules with a rifle at the canvas. I mean, she was in Life magazine for that, and I mean, you could call her if you want to use this word, a legitimate contender, you know, in the 60s, Yoko Ono, perhaps Alison Knowles, although Alison Knowles was much less well known in the 60s. But, I mean, this group of women, they were not talking about them as role models at all. They were talking about the abstract expressionists. And, I mean, I got a very strong feeling that they saw the dance without hearing the music. In other words, that they did not really have a vocation for this, but they were trying to understand, like somehow they knew that Jackson Pollock had done something outlandish, or in other words, that he had sort of run amok on the canvas or something like that, and that this had gotten him a great deal of attention. And they were trying to compute, you know, like how does one use that, you know, or so is this what you have to do, or something like that. I mean, that was another. It was an object lesson for me. I mean, it was a very powerful object lesson for me to see people sort of approaching the social role in that way. Whereas you know, and I mean, my point of view was invisible to them, and it still would be. I mean, I'm sure of that. But I mean, I'd asked, you know, what is the artist's claim on me? And I decided the artist does not have any such claim. I decided that the idea that one objectify his self-expression on behalf of other people, I decided that was absurd. And I quit. I mean, you know, they and I were running in opposite directions. I mean, I guess that I went to this thing because I probably understood that I would learn something, you know, that it would be an object lesson of great importance to me. Only the one, and they kind of, I mean, I think that some of them just felt that just the fact that a man was there caused some of the women either to speak differently or to be sort of simply to sort of shape their remarks by the fact that a man, I mean, this is almost like Genet's The Blacks or something like that. I mean, but at any rate, they discontinued inviting men. But I probably, you know, sort of gleaned whatever I could have gleaned from the one meeting. It would be very interesting, actually, to find today sort of who was at that meeting, you know, and what became to them, you know, did any of them eventually have a high-profile career, you know, as an artist or something like that? Because I don't know that. I would like to know that, actually. But at any rate, that was something that happened in '69. But so we're in '70. I'm working in the office. I'm visiting Dennis Johnson. At one point, I was seeing my analyst, trying to do little scraps of work. Then I get the opportunity to move down here to Soho in the middle of the year, and I quit the job. I began at the New School in September, and I had as I say, I'd been in the sectarian left in the mid-'60s. And when I was studying economics at NYU, I detested it. I detested what they were teaching, but I was not ready to challenge it intellectually yet. But I knew that I had to go to an economics department that was not simply teaching sort of the conventional, sort of straight down the middle economics. And I did eventually, I settled on the New School. It was the only graduate school that I could have gone to. I mean, for whatever it's worth, the New School really was different at that time from other graduate schools as far as the economics program was concerned. I mean, actually, I would tell people that I was at the New School or something like that, and they would say, "Oh, that socialist place," or "Oh, they're all communists there," or something like that. And I remember, I never responded when somebody said that to me. I never responded. You know, I never. How do you say? I mean, argumentative is too strong, but I didn't say anything. But I do remember thinking, well, actually, I mean, I'm the only communist at the New School. You know, I mean, I didn't know what they thought they were telling me.
Maybe you were the one they were talking about.
No, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid that they thought that all of those terrible people who were sort of trying to straddle the fence, you know, I mean, that becomes a very technical question, but I mean, the people at the New School, I mean, even though if it had been possible to vote communist, I mean, many of the instructors, I'm convinced that they would have. I mean, if the United States had the kind of parties that are in Italy and France. But in terms of the actual making the break in economics, I mean, they certainly did not have the ability to do that. And I mean, they were teaching. That sort of gets way ahead of things because I did not really have, so to speak, my final confrontation with my own professors until I defended my dissertation in 1978. But at any rate, let me see, what are some of the other things that happened? Zohm and Zeman, I think that they were preparing the book, which eventually came out as Happenings and Fluxus. And they contacted me. And it was probably at that point that I wrote my open letter to art promoters, which I wrote in 1970, where I was just explaining very briefly that I rejected art in 1962. After 1962, I published a good deal of my work in art venues, but it was just because it was the only place that I could get published. And that I feel that it created a great deal of confusion about what I was doing. I was very upset with that, and I sort of, I washed my hands of the art world and so forth and so on. And I think that I sent it to Zohm and Zeman, and along with a number of my other essays. I don't think they ever used any of it, by the way, although they told me that they were going to use it, but they didn't. Then in September, I think that Ray Johnson curated a mail art invitational at the Whitney. And I think I was invited to submit it, so I just sent the same open letter. And I think it was probably shown at the Whitney at that time. I actually do not have I wasn't sort of diligent enough to get a checklist. I didn't even know what a checklist was probably at that time, so I have no actual proof that my letter was in the show, but it's in my own records that it was. I still have the invitation to attend the opening. Yeah, okay. But this is the open letter to art promoters, my only exhibited item in a mail art show at the Whitney in 1970. All of my writings are in original genres. Here is a list of some of them together with the academic disciplines to which they are most closely related. The perception dissociation of physics, theoretical physics, subjective propositional vibration is mathematical logic, the logic of admissible contradictions, mathematical logic, primary paradox, epistemology, and subversion theory, political philosophy. For want of a better term, these writings could be described as avant-garde science. Unfortunately for me, there seems to be general agreement among the intellectuals that science must be restricted to conservative academic specialists, while the only thing that can be avant-garde is inane modern art cliches. For this reason, hardly a single one of my best writings has been published. I also have the problem that there are so many faddish counterfeit cultural revolutions going on today that that intellectuals are going to become too jaded and muddle-headed to appreciate my work. And then I say, for example, my modern art uses transistors, rheostats, computers, and all the latest technical devices. Well, obviously I was referring to EAT when I was experiments in art and technology by saying that. By the way, I read that. I mean, I would say exactly the same thing today. I mean, it's interesting. In other words, like the whole problem of fake sophistication, or the faddish, the faddish revolution. I mean, I would say today that it became much more acute. I mean, going towards the end of the 70s, but apparently I was already just as concerned about it in 1970. As for art, my position since 1962 has been that Brand is superior to art. My pamphlet, Down with Art, gives a definition and proof of this thesis. The reason I am on your mailing list is probably that in the past I allowed some of my writings to be published in art journals. I did this because nobody else would publish them. However, the result has been a hideous misunderstanding of my writings, which threatens to devalue them completely. Well, I would say I have exactly the same problem today. I now feel that it is better for my writings not to be published at all than for them to be presented in an art context. As a matter of fact, by the way, I think that all of these pieces that I mentioned in the thing were published in Blueprint in 1975. So I did manage to get a small amount of publication eventually. The subversion theory, let me see, that's one of the things that I want to mention, that even while I was at NYU, I was not yet really ready to go on the attack in terms of bourgeois economics. But as far as sociology was concerned, I mean, I was ready to start rethinking the problem of subversion. I think that by the end of the 60s, wasn't there some sort of war between communist countries in 1969, maybe between the Soviet Union and China, I think, in 1969. I mean, I'd begun to understand that there was something terribly out of whack with sort of the official Marxist project. And also, I may have, I don't know so much about the counterculture. I mean, I had very mixed feelings about the counterculture. But I decided that there had to be a sociology of subversion, which no longer, it no longer assumed that the perfect world was just around the corner. And it no longer assumed that history was linear and that it would come to some unique conclusion. And I just mentioned that because I began writing about that in '69. I did write a piece on it in 1970, which I think was called Amoral Subversion. And then, I continued working on it in the early '70s, and it eventually turns up in Blueprint as an essay. But that is another one of the events of that year. So, I mean, I guess that in terms of my exposition, I guess it sums up a year that started out in very unpromising, very, very unpromising, as if I might have just become a hack in an office or something like that. I mean, it seems that was really possible. And by the end of the year, I'm a graduate student at the New School. And that was more tolerable, more tolerable than the office had been. The art world?
Yeah.
I was not paying attention to the art world that would be chronicled in Art Forum. I mean, I only very peripherally did I know about Avalanche and art and language and so forth and so on. Only very peripherally, even though I mean I had known Bob Morris at the beginning of the '60s, but I drifted out of touch. And you know, like the few things that I mentioned, like the fact that I was able to speak directly to Machunis and get him to change my piece in the anthology. I mean, I was still, as far as I had contacts in that world, I guess they were with Machunis and with Lamont Young. But you see, for me, something like Pranot's first performances in New York, I mean, that is an event of overwhelming importance in my mind. I mean, it's far more important than what would have been reported in and the Art Forum situation and Castelli, whenever Castelli came downtown and all of that sort of thing. I mean, I would say that I mean, I had no respect for that at all. I mean, to me, I mean, they were well. I mean, somehow they had taken dematerialization and minimalism in the installation, and they had turned it into turned it into something that could be sort of produced by I mean, it's the women of the women artists in revolution had not particularly even grasped that generation. I mean, their mind was back with the abstract expressionists, and I mean the sort of thing. Is it the Pump House Gang where Tom Wolfe writes about Walter de Maria? It may be.
Painted Word? No.
I'm not. I would have to check that. I'm not sure whether is it perhaps the Painted Word that starts off about Walter de Maria. I mean, one of his books starts off about Walter de Maria and a commission that he did for Skull. Correct me if I get any of this wrong. Yes, but yes, the women artists in revolution. Seemingly, we're not really aware, of that generation. I mean, the sort of proto conceptualism. Was I? Are you kidding? I mean, I was working in an office. I was a Wall Street hack.